This country is, in spite of our recent chaos, is on balance pretty likely to go to the FBI compared to most institutions and groups. Some people don't give in to the dollar sign. They are hooked by ideology. Happened to Lee Harvey Oswald. He was a very, very pointed and enthusiastic killer. And he was to assassinate Kennedy and return back to Moscow and have there be cheering and enthusiasm for him at the Moscow airport.
How did Stalin's leaders that were left after he died in the mid-50s, how did they feel about Kennedy?
Khrushchev, he wanted Kennedy dead, but he realized that he might get caught and labeled as the assassin of the American president, and that could mean nuclear war between the U.S. and the Soviet Union.
Interesting.
He changed, and the decision was made by Oswald not to listen and not to obey anybody, and he basically executed him.
My guest today is the former 16th director of CIA, Mr. James Woolsey. And we have a lot of interesting topics and experiences that he's had that we're going to get into today. With that being said, James, thank you so much for being a guest on Valuetainment.
Thank you. Great to be with you.
So it's anytime I remember one time I had a CIA agent. We were running a executive meeting with a company called Vistage, and I was the host. I had to bring somebody in as a guest. And it was a former CIA agent. He came in. Every single CEO and entrepreneur showed up because they just wanted to hear the different stories. And it was by far the most popular guest we had where CEOs wanted to hear from a CIA agent. Go figure why a CEO, but it's exciting to share your story with our audience. So, if we can go back on how you got started, how does one go from, graduating from high school to saying, I want to go be a CIA agent? And then not only that, you get a phone call from Bill Clinton saying, hey, I want to meet with you. And that leads to you being the director of CIA. So how did this whole thing get started for you?
Well, it was close to being an accident. What happened was that I was a conservative Democrat, still kind of am. And I think the administration, as the administration came into its position with the new administration, they wanted to have probably all parts of the system, of the political system, represented. And they didn't have any conservative Democrats. And so they named me, but they hadn't done their research all that thoroughly. And they announced me as Admiral Woolsey. And I said, I never was an admiral, never got above captain in the Army. And they had a crowd gathered by that point to hear the announcement. And one of the staffers said, whoops, we better change the press release. So I was a last minute conservative Democrat. And that's why I think they searched for me and found me. And it was not a real polished operation.
Very, very interesting. By the way, who would you say, because, you don't hear that term too often today, who would you say is a current conservative Democrat? And would you put JFK as a conservative Democrat?
I would have at the time, yes. The last one I think probably was Joe Lieberman. He's often named as that. But Joe is retired. As a matter of fact, the last time I called myself a Joe Lieberman Democrat, Joe was in the group with me. He said, Jim, you've got to stop saying that. I'm not in politics anymore. I said, Joe, if I can't be a conservative Democrat and call myself a Lieberman Democrat, I'll go back to Harry. Harry Truman was a good president. Why not use him? So, but in any case, conservative Democrat it is.
Conservative Democrat. Do we have a lot of current conservative Democrats, would you say?
Maybe two. No, not so much. I think the Democrats have yawed over into being progressives largely, and the Republicans have gotten very much into, I think, some of the innovations of how to create a new movement for themselves. And I'm not sure there are any conservative Democrats. I think they're kind of gone with the wind.
You said two of them. Is Manchin one of them? Is that who you're thinking is one of
I
them?
would say Manchin, and I still count Lieberman.
Okay, got it. Okay, I mean, if you think about it, a lot of people would probably be, America probably would be comfortable with someone more on the center left or center right than being far left or far right. It would balance out the eagle's wings if somebody was more on the center left or right rather than going far to the right or left.
I think you're right.
Yeah. So how was that phone call made when you got the call and saying, hey, the president wants to meet with you? And were you expecting it? I know you said it was kind of a surprise, but was it something where you were on a short list of 5 names that you knew about?
Not really. I was on a short list of people that they were talking to, but I thought they were just talking to a group of people who were being considered to be director, not who had already been chosen as an admiral to be director. It was. It turned out I was on a shorter list than I knew.
How was your first sit down with President Clinton?
Well, we really didn't sit down. It happened very quickly. President Clinton chatted with me at the inauguration ceremony for a few seconds. That's about it.
Yeah, I heard you tell a joke one time. You said, in the 2 years of me being the director of CIA, the plane that tried to fly into the Pentagon or White House, that was actually me trying to get a meeting with the president because he wouldn't sit down with you.
Well, that's basically true. Bill Clinton is a speed reader, and so he didn't want to sit down every morning and have the director of Central Intelligence read sheets of paper to him. He could read a lot faster himself, and so he would just let the system operate. And he's a speed reader, so occasionally you wouldn't know what he was reading. But I remember one time he said, "Jim, have you read that new book on Africa by so and so? What did you think of it?" And I happily had read it, but he was reading a lot of books as president and talking to people about them. But it wasn't very formal, and he didn't want there to be any nod toward having a system of reviewing.
Is that a protocol? Like typically the president's first meetings to get a briefing by the director of CIA every morning. Is that typically historically what's been the case, or no?
It's happened and has been the case several times, I think, but there's nothing required about it.
Got it.
The president designates the director as director, and the director gets briefed on this panoply of briefs, and then started meeting with the president the next day. But that changed in part with me.
Yeah, that's what I wonder. I mean, if you're a president, you would want to meet with the director of CIA to kind of see what's going on. If it's not once a day, maybe once a week to just kind of be briefed. Especially when you say in 2 years you never got a chance to meet with them. Were you reporting? Did it kind of like, how you run a company and sometimes you put your org chart together and you say, look, I'm the CEO, I have the CFO, the COO, the CIO, the CTO, whatever, and I got 5 direct reports. Typically, the CEO doesn't want to have more than 5 reports. Sometimes it's 7, but let's just say 5 is the magical number. Were you reporting to the chief of staff? Did he want you to go through another layer before you go through him? Who were you directly reporting to?
Functionally, yes. Tony
Okay.
was chief of staff, and he liked it if the president would report to him, and that was kind of the way it worked out. It wasn't absolutely a rule, and when we would go in together, Tony and I, to say something to the president, it was okay with them as we walked out. If I stopped by the president's desk and said, "Mr. President, you want to pay particular attention to X and Y report today. It was that sort of thing was fun.
Got it. So day before you became the director of CIA versus the day after, the day you became a director of CIA, what were some of your responsibilities? How dramatically did your responsibilities change the day after becoming the director of CIA?
Well, I think the main change is the change from being just a reporter of intelligence to being in a situation where you can recommend and sometimes get approved covert actions. A covert action is an event that's put together in order to try to influence what the policy is rather than just report on it. And it's not, there's nothing sneaky about it from the point of view of the president not knowing about it. The president's fully briefed and he gets a signed recommendation from the director, and it all is proper and done. But it's an action item, and that sometimes those are successful and sometimes they're not. And Bill Clinton was very disturbed. He said one time in a closed meeting that he had not gone into Rwanda and stopped the Hutus killing of other Rwandan tribes. It was really the Tutsis were massacred essentially during the Rwanda killing fields of late 93, 94. And that what I think President Clinton didn't want to have is that he did not want another event like the Black Hawk Down, where American troops got killed on the ground in Somalia. And so he was being very cautious, and he did not stop the Rwandan Hutus from killing the Tutsis. And he was very, as he thought about it over time, he decided that had been a big mistake. And he would often tell people, and this is one thing I rather admire about Clinton, he would tell people, okay, you need to know the biggest mistake I made as president. It was not going in and protecting the Tutsis. I should never have let them massacre the Hutus. And all presidents don't do things like that. They don't say right out in the National Security Council meeting, I made a big mistake and here's what it was. Because that was close to 1 million people that died as a result of that decision of his. And it's something that has come up in time, a number of circumstances. But it's an important issue, and it's something that he had the manhood and grace to deal with straightforwardly.
Was that during your time when 1 million people died during his watch? Was it when you were his director of CIA, or was it afterwards?
It was largely during about 94, and right. I was director in 93 to 95.
Got it. Do you think it could have been prevented if he was communicating with you more often and getting updates, or it wouldn't have made a difference?
I don't think the decision about going in to protect the Tutsis or not would have changed based on who was director. He just didn't want to do that.
So, so it wouldn't have made a difference whether you would have given him the briefing or not, because he was determined not to make the move. But he admitted to the fact that that decision was a decision he made that cost 1 million people's lives. So he took responsibility for it, which is what great leaders do. So, prior to being a director of CIA, how much experience did you have being a CIA agent yourself?
When I went on active duty in the Army to fulfill my requirements as an infantry officer in the Reserve Officers Training Corps requirements, I had a choice whether to work on intelligence issues or work on issues related to the Vietnam War. Since I had been a founder and president of Yale Citizens for Eugene McCarthy for president and had opposed the Vietnam War. I picked intelligence rather than the Vietnam War. And I worked on intelligence matters largely having to do with satellite design, reconnaissance satellite. And I did that for close to 2 years. And then after that, I began doing some National Security Council work for Brent Scowcroft and worked in the Pentagon. So it was in the technical side of things and was relatively short, a couple of years. But that's what my experience was.
Yeah, I mean, I look at your resume: advisor during the military U.S. delegation for strategic arms limitation talks in Vienna, 1969 to 1970, general counsel to U.S. Senate Committee on Armed Services, 70-73, Undersecretary of the Navy, 77 and 79, delegate at large of the U.S.-Soviet strategic arm reduction talks and nuclear and space arms talks, Geneva, 1983 to 86, ambassador to the negotiation on conventional armed forces in Europe, Vienna, 89 to 91. So it's interesting that you had a variety of background on different things today. Does that kind of give you an edge on why they thought about recruiting you to be the director of CIA?
It's possible. Okay. That reasonably broad experience, although not deep and not real lengthy. I mean, it was screened over a 2-3 year set of assignments.
When you became a director of CIA, were you given some intel where you yourself you thought the outcome or the blame was somebody, and then you found out it was somebody else, where you sat there and said, this is pretty interesting on the intel that was given on what event took place here? Was there anything that you yourself were extra curious about that as a director of CIA, now you can have access to find out more about that information?
Yes, drones. I was an enthusiast for making a transition for at least an important portion of the photo reconnaissance part of the agency and the Pentagon that would have backed up the idea of relying more heavily on drones. As a matter of fact, in the early mid 80s, before I became General Counsel of the Senate Armed Services Committee, I was a private citizen doing one thing and another, and I got asked to come over to Israel to work with the IDF, and I did things like that from time to time. And because I was over there, I saw something that I was really impressed by, which was essentially a group of very young Israeli troops flying drones, which I hadn't seen before in the American military, flying drones. And they seemed like they were just almost certainly too young to be doing things with military forces. And so I asked the colonel who was in charge of the Israeli unit. I said, Colonel, this is really an interesting operation. You've got these young troops flying drones, and they're shooting down tank ordnance from above them. There's just a lot here going on. What's going on? Why do you have just a very young troops doing something like this? It looks like it's hard to do and important and difficult. And the colonel grinned and he said, well, he said they ought to be fairly young. He said, this is the Israeli team that essentially does operations in training, and the reason they're young is that this is the Israeli Model Airplane Club, and we just put them into uniform and called them up, and they're doing a great job. I remember thinking that's smart. that's you got a whole new way of using ordnance and different new ordnance. So you go to the 14-year-olds, and sure enough, they're doing a great job.
Very interesting. I recently interviewed the former director of Mossad, Shabtai Shavit. I don't know if you are familiar with Shabtai Shavit.
I just went to a conference where he was speaking, and I introduced him. He was a good friend for the 2 years we were both heads of our services.
I bet. And the question I have for you is, when I asked him a question, I said, look, everybody is trained by somebody, right? Like, I'm from Iran. So the Savak was trained by MI6 and Secret Service and a little bit of, the Mossad. You think about, MI6 was trained by US, CIA, and CIA was also trained a little bit by MI6 and kind of share each other what they know, maybe not all the secrets. The question I asked them, who trained Mossad to be as good as they are? So I'm curious to know who you would say trained the Mossad to be as creative and as, some would say brutal as they are.
I think it's more cross-referenced, really, than that. I think the CIA, and including the NSA, which does some very useful and important work, the code breakers. I think that they and the MI6 Brits and CIA work with one another very readily and very easily. And they also work very closely with called I5, the Commonwealth intelligence troops, the Australians and the New Zealanders and the Brits and so forth. So it's more a group of 6 or 8 that work together on all sorts of things all the time than it is a single sequence.
Why would the secret intelligence groups teach each other their tactics of what they do?
Basically, it's because we have no major secrets anyway from the Brits and the Canadians and the Aussies. We're all in the same ballpark.
Who's one you wouldn't be comfortable sharing secrets with? If you were to say there's no way in the world we would do anything with the following 3, who would it be?
That would be Iran, Iran, Iran.
So Iran's at the top. So you're more uncomfortable with teaching Iran anything than China. I think China's doing a clinic right now around the world with people. No,
China's doing a lot, and they worry me, and the Russians worry me. I'd say realistically, Russia, China, Iran, are Syria. Any of the countries that are clearly at odds with us, but that's 4 or 5. There are a few that would work with us, even though not all the time.
Interesting. So before we get into your new book that's coming out, Operation Dragon, Inside the Kremlin's Secret War on America, I want to kind of ask you maybe a couple other questions here regarding today's times. I've asked this question from multiple different people to see what their answer would be. Being a director of CIA 93 to 95 had different issues than we're facing today, than maybe in the 70s, than maybe in the 60s. It's different challenges during different decades. What concerns you the most today? I mean, I'm talking, is it cyber warfare? Is it bionuclear? Is it nuclear? Is it bio warfare? Is it oil war that could take place? Is it, what is the top concern that you have with all the different challenges we're facing today?
Well, it's tough because it's a combination, on the one hand, of intelligence forces or groups. I mean, I'm much more worried about Iran than I am about most any other country. But in addition to naming some names like Iran, I'm really quite concerned about the specialities that have been adopted by Russia and China, which are very, very troubling, because Russia, for example, has been working very hard on cyber, particularly artificial intelligence, and that is a continuing source of confusion and difficulty for the United States because the Russians lie, cheat, and steal about who they are, and that makes it very difficult. What do you do to somebody with a face mask that's extremely well designed, and you're sure that he's a Syrian? In fact, he may not be. He may be opposed to Syrians. I don't know. So there are a lot of difficulties with masking and such. Technology, cyber war in all dimensions is really hard to deal with. And I'd say that set of technologies and that set of governments are 6, 8, 10, 12 really, really troubling combinations of individual countries and individual texts and operators.
So when you were director of CIA from 93 to 95, obviously Russia was probably your biggest threat. Would you agree Russia would be number one on the list, 93 to 95 as a nation?
I think probably so. We were not as worried about Russia then as I think we should have been, and we worked to some extent on the steps Russia could take in masking themselves, and they did that a lot. The Potemkin village history, the disguise for a whole village by Count Potemkin, who was Catherine the Great's male friend, was one of the things the Russians did, and did going back to the 17th century. They were good at deception, and we were always needing to penetrate that, and it was not easy.
During that time, was China at all even a thought? Was it even something where you woke up and, hey, we have to be careful what China is going to be doing next? Obviously, Russia was up there, Iran was up there. Was China still in the top three at the time, or no?
I don't know that it was in the top three, but it was very close. It was in the top one or two or three. You can't really tell, but they were a problem, but not as serious a problem I think we thought as say Russia was. Now it may be different. The ranking of the Chinese and Russians and Iranians, Syrians is hard to parse, but all 4 or 5 of those countries are worrisome.
So, the one thing that sometimes I wonder about threats is when you were the director of CIA at the time, the story of Aldrich Ames, who was arrested February 21st, in 1994 for treason, spying against the United States, et cetera. So CIA was criticized for not taking action immediately. And you came out and said, I'm not the kind that's going to go out there and fire the guy. Let's investigate a little more before find out who this guy is, if he's really involved. And then later on that year, December 28, 1994, you resigned. So the question I have for you with this is, how, you've heard the saying before, Alexander the Great, I have met the enemy, it is I, or America's biggest enemy is within the inside. In a family, the thing that could break up a great family is within the inside. How much do we have to worry about another Aldrich Ames or 2 or 3 or 10, sharing some of our intel with our enemies today?
We have to worry about the inside. It's a serious problem. most CIA and DIA and other intelligence people or other people on the inside, military officers and the like. Lee Harvey Oswald, after all, was a Marine sniper. So, because of that scope, we do have to be very careful with our people, including our very senior people who work on really important matters. But it's not something that we can readily brush aside. And it's also something that you want to be careful not to get too fired up about it, or even paranoids have real enemies. But you don't want to spread a doctrine throughout the intelligence community that you're suspicious of everybody. You ought to be
It's interesting.
we're concerned and attentive about everybody, but we need our career people, and we need them badly.
Yeah, I bet that's kind of weird to, how do you how do you watch your agents, and how do you, have detectives to detect any signs of espionage from your CIA agents who are professionals at kind of keeping things undercover and people not knowing what they do for a living? It's a tough task.
I said to one of my successors, and he didn't think it was a good analogy, but I said it anyway in a meeting, that we lived with a national security establishment in which we um, send people abroad, military usually, to fight and die for their country. We also sometimes send people from my organization abroad to lie, cheat, and steal for the country. And I had one of my colleagues say, "We don't steal." I said, "Well, what do you call it if you get your hands on an enemy draft security set of files? You don't just kind of smile and leave them there. You give them to the boss, find some way to use them, and the best thing that's ever been said on that, I think, is the wonderful Winston Churchill quote, which is that it is so important to take very good care of intelligence that it's a essentially like a dominant pattern of work.
What do you mean? So Churchill said it's important to carry your intelligence because they could do what? Because they,
I think the exact quote. It's about oh, I know what it is. It's that it's so important. It's intelligence is so important and must be protected by a bodyguard of lies. One of Churchill's,
intelligence is so important that it must be protected by the bodyguard of lies.
and that's Winston Churchill.
Wow.
And he one of his books is called Bodyguard of Lies.
Hmm.
And it's an important point. Churchill was very good on these issues, to put it mildly.
Yeah, he's a obviously in many ways he's seen as one of the greatest leaders of all time, and he's hated, and he's a lot of misconception about him, and people who didn't really understand his wiring, because he was a pretty weird, strong personality leader. When wartime came, they trusted him the most to want to execute, and some of the other guys like Chamberlain were not having the guts to go out there and do what the necessary work was required. But going back to it, so espionage, CIA agents flipping on us, or DIA, or whoever it is that we're even some soldiers there, right? What is the common tipping point where somebody says, "I'm willing to flip"? Is it women where they end up meeting some, the stuff that you see in movies, a Red Sparrow or something like that, and they all of a sudden like, "Oh shoot, I totally screwed up. I gave too much intel to the wrong person because this woman really was able to woo me and I'm in too deep? Is it money? Because, you know, CIA agents don't make a lot of money. If you think about the kind of money CIA agents make, it's not like they're taking home $1 million and, you know, rolling in the dough with a Porsche 911 parked outside. That only happens in movies. Is it a deep hate for the institution and what America stands for? What typically gets somebody want to flip against its own nation?
Well, lots of people can show weakness, and different types of people have and do. Ames came into his desire for a great new car and a lot more money than he had. Some people don't give in to the dollar sign. They are hooked by ideology on the other side, and that happened. Again, I'll use an example that happened to Lee Harvey Oswald. He was a very, very pointed and enthusiastic killer, and he was what he really wanted more than anything else was to assassinate Kennedy and return back to Moscow and have there be cheering and enthusiasm for him at the Moscow airport. He said that on several occasions. So people operate for strange mixtures of reasons sometimes, but it's not always the happy pleasures of friendship, or it's not always the angry pleasures of getting an added salary in your pocket. It's different things to different people.
It makes sense. I mean, it's similar temptations, but you wonder how you're able to get somebody to stay loyal to a country and an institution when they're not making the money to not be tempted to do something otherwise. Um, okay, so you know, why don't we go and talk about your book and the JFK assassination, and you know, what your thoughts were on who was behind it based on access to research and folks you worked on with the book. So when you and I go out there and read about JFK assassination, there's a lot of different theories that come out, and you've read all the theories probably way more than any of us because you wrote a book about this and you've had to do research on it. So whether it's the, you know, the bullet, was it him? Was it you know, the mob? Was it the mafia? Was it Johnson, Lyndon Johnson? Was it a couple people that were missing politically later on? Maybe they were involved. Was it, who was it? So based on your research and theories that you have, what really happened with the JFK assassination?
Well, first of all, we call the book Operation Dragon, and dragon in the Russian terminology a lot of the time means very effective deception. That's what they sometimes call their deception operations, and that creates a reason for them to move into both trying to self-aggrandize and trying to help the new country or institution or group of people that they have decided to, unfortunately, to help. So there's those two batches of people who get involved in working for the other side in intelligence, and counterintelligence against them is what we in the intelligence business spend a lot of time and effort trying to forestall.
So what conclusion did you come up with when you wrote this book with former Romanian spy chief Ion Mihai Pacepa? What conclusion did you come up with on who assassinated President Kennedy?
It seemed reasonably clear to Mike Pacepa. We all called him Mike, by the way, because that his Romanian name with Ion Mihai is Mike. And I think it's fair to say that uh, Mike was a Romanian patriot and did not and worked hard to help us during the post-war years, the post-civil, post-Cold War years, and during the Cold War. Both. He worked hard to help us corral and limit and penetrate and understand the enemy, and he was at the thick of the fray. At one point, he was being chased. I don't know if his wife was in that particular chase, but he was in a chase with Carlos the Jackal, who had been tasked to kill him. And so this was a GE engineer whose father was a General Electric engineer. He worked in the establishment of infrastructure of the system, but he had a flair and an ability for counterintelligence that was very, very effective. And we ended up being able to use his skills effectively, and he was a remarkable individual. He passed away, by the way, almost exactly a week ago.
He passed away exactly a week ago.
Almost exactly.
Wow. So when you're sitting there and investigating this, there's a lot of people. Again, a lot of different claims have been made on who killed JFK. Why specifically? Like, maybe I'll ask the question a different way. What is your level of certainty on what you believe in with the events that took place with the assassination of John F. Kennedy?
Quite high. And I have a major reason for its being quite high, and that's that I had Mike Ian Mihai Pacepa for years, spending time and effort cozying up to the Russian cabinet, essentially, chatting briefly with Khrushchev during vodka breaks, etc. The whole world of essentially intelligence was open to Pacepa in ways that it was not open really to virtually anybody else. And so that's one thing. Mike was able to get into contacts, and for example, Ceausescu, the Romanian intelligence chief, and actually chief of decision making for much of the time in Romania. Pacepa was just a great gate into that world, and I think that we were very lucky to have him and his very able wife as sources, and they served us extremely well.
Got it. So the claim you guys make, you and the co-author, is Lee Harvey was a KGB associate who was personally instructed by Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev to assassinate President Kennedy sometime shortly after the Soviets changed their minds and Oswald was told to drop the plan, but Oswald, harboring a blinding love for all the USSR, refused. So that's the claim. That's pretty much the premise of the book. But how did Stalin view Kennedy? What was Stalin's relationship and view of Kennedy?
Oh, he hated him with a passion because Kennedy had basically made him look foolish in the Cuban Missile Crisis and weak, turning his own ships around so they wouldn't confront the Americans. Khrushchev was furious at Kennedy, and he wanted him dead, and he wanted to have him killed.
Is that Stalin or is that Khrushchev? Who wanted him dead?
That was Khrushchev. Stalin died in what, 53? This is all post-Stalin, but not by much. It was the early 50s.
I guess the question I would have is Stalin's camp, you know, the secret speech that Khrushchev gave, the 4 hours where he trashed Stalin and Stalin is this and Stalin is that and Stalin is this. Stalin's people were still in power. Obviously, they were not running. It was Khrushchev, but it was Stalin's people. I'm trying to find out, how did Stalin's leaders that were left after he died in the mid-50s, how did they feel about Kennedy?
Well, the book goes into that in some detail. Mike's in my book. They also wanted Kennedy dead and were extremely hostile to him. And then what happened really was that Khrushchev finally got a little bit of balance and sense into his thick skull. He was essentially ready. By the 60s, early 60s, to move against Oswald, whom he knew about, and so forth, to do something to create a situation where the Kennedy would be killed, and it was only really because of his hatred of Kennedy that he was willing to take that step. And then when he did take that step and ordered it happen, it was not necessarily face to face with Oswald, but it was substantively easily known by the bureaucracy, the party bureaucracy, that he had given the order. He had so given the order and with such clarity that Oswald learned that he was being tasked with this great, marvelous, wonderful job that he so wanted more than anything in the world. And he essentially gets approval to move against Kennedy. And the thing, and what really happened was that Oswald was picked and moved against Kennedy, and then Khrushchev got a little bit of sense into his thick skull. And he wanted very much, more than anybody ever has wanted a president dead, he wanted Kennedy dead. But he realized that he might get caught and labeled as the assassin of the American president, and that could mean war between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, nuclear war. He decided he didn't want nuclear war, so with a real sense of unhappiness, he changed and pulled in and pulled back, and Khrushchev basically dictated that, and that was where things were heading when the decision was made by Oswald not to listen and not to obey anybody. Oswald turned around essentially after having been part of the group that was ordered to kill Kennedy. Mike believes, and I believe that was clearly a decision by Oswald to continue on and kill Kennedy under a vague overall charge from Khrushchev.
You know, I've spoken to folks who I've interviewed about this topic. One is Jim Jenkins, who was one of the folks in the room who held JFK's brain after he was assassinated, and he saw cuts, incisions, and he saw bullet wounds from the back. So for him, you know, there's no way he believes anything that happened from the front, you know, where everyone claims it was Oswald. Lots of people think it was CIA because it was an inside job, because LBJ hated Kennedy, and, you know, he just wanted him gone because LBJ always was more aspirational, wanting to be a president than Kennedy was, and he couldn't stand the family. He would always say, I want those Irish men out of there, and, you know, I want to go in there and be the president, and he was aspirational to want to be president, LBJ. And we all know what happened when John F. Kennedy went up to him saying, "I want you to be my VP." It was not the easiest conversation. So,
but I don't think LBJ was aspirational enough to do what Khrushchev did. The key thing here is, if one did look at the brain of Kennedy's brain, one saw something that only the autopsy people who worked with the Treasury Department, medical folks, saw, which was that there's whole books on the autopsy, by the way. But the thing that you want to pay attention to is the Treasury Department study that was done in order to look at the brain of Kennedy once he had been shot, and to see whether or not the way the blood flowed and the soft tissue flowed was consistent with one type of approach toward being killed by a rifle versus another type. And the Treasury Department's study of this is new enough now that it hasn't been relied upon particularly by the anti-autopsy people and the other members of the 3,000 people who wrote books about Kennedy. The killing of Kennedy was consistent with soft tissue being at the front end of the brain and consistent with the type of entry wound. Whereas, I'll let you read all this in the Treasury book because it's the one that has the detail in it. But the other sort of texts of information essentially came from killing with a shot that ended up going through the much harder surface of the brain rather than the soft under the skull tissue. And I think it's clear from what Mike has told us, and what I think it's clear from what Chepa saw and passed on, that the death of Kennedy was consistent and highly consistent with a bullet coming from where the bullet finally was said to enter Kennedy's skull.
So if Lee Harvey Oswald did it, why would Ruby kill him afterwards? Like, what connection does Ruby have to Russia? I mean, what does Ruby have to do? Because Ruby's connection was to the mob.
Yeah, well, Ruby's connection was to the mob, and the mob ordered him through Cuba because they had the driving responsibility for this. They had, standing in line, they had people who were willing to kill Kennedy. They were ready to go, and they were ready and willing to take a action against Kennedy, and that required them to take action against Lee Harvey Oswald, because if Oswald was still alive at that point, remember that's after one day, and Oswald is at the jail, and the famous photo of Ruby shooting him in the stomach. But what happened was that Oswald gets killed by Ruby in the jail as they pass by one another. And Ruby is killed because neither the mafia nor the Castro want him, nor the Russians want him alive talking to anybody.
Do you have, is this speculation or do you have proof of this communication?
I think it's pretty clear I'll let I have stayed away in the book, and I will stay away from words like uh, absolutely clear and so forth. But I think both motivation and the geography of where people were point very clearly toward Ruby killing Oswald and having done so because the Russians and the Cubans didn't want him or anybody to know what he was doing.
Are you a sports fan? Are you someone who likes sports?
I have gone both ways. When the Redskins were here, I went to almost every game. Other sports, I tend toward baseball, but that's gone on evil days as a result of the virus. So as soon as baseball comes back in a sensible way, I'll be out there in the stadiums.
So you know how a kid is raised in a family in Boston and he grows up hating the Yankees, right?
Yeah.
And he's 5 years old sitting next to his daddy and he's just watching oh my gosh, you know what? These Yankees are con artists. And the kid grows up 30 years later, these Yankees are con artists. And then his kid, and generationally, they hate the Yankees. And it stays with them from a kid till later on. Even 70 years old, they still hate the Yankees. Magic till today, when he hears about the Celtics, his body shivers because he can't stand the Celtics because it was his number one enemy, right? And you go on and on and on and on and on. How much of you, knowing when you were coming up, enemy of the state number one was Russia. Fast forward today, how much of it has to do with you just despise Russia, where you think they would be capable of taking out Kennedy because you had aspirations of Kennedy, because you're a conservative Democrat? And how much is it just logically you said, you know what, I just want to write a book about this because I'm certain Lee Harvey Oswald was behind the assassination of Kennedy?
None of the above. I went into the world of national security through interest and developed when I was working on the reconnaissance satellite stuff for the Pentagon. That was two to 2.5 years of basically technical research and understanding how the satellites work and so on. I didn't feel an emotional requirement to do anything for the Russians. As a matter of fact, when I negotiated the conventional forces in Europe treaty back in the late '80s, I got along reasonably well with the Russians. They were not my favorites, but I could get along with them and did.
Well, what was the fabric of doing business with Russians? Like, what did you know they stood for? ... Here's what it was doing business with Russians.
The thing that I found to be their saving grace, in a sense, was that they had a lot of times they had good senses of humor. I often look at people's senses of humor to make temporary judgments. And the Russians, on the whole, had pretty good senses of humor. My German friends in the negotiations didn't so much, but my Russian acquaintances, I could get along with, and in all of those cases, the best humor was certainly British. I mean, the Brits just do that well. But I did get along with the Russians okay, and neither sports nor that was really central to my decision making. I would do my best to have decisions come through in a way that let me have a lighthearted demeanor in dealing with the 27 countries that I had to deal with. And I always tried to pay people compliments and so forth to keep things on an even keel.
So who told dirtier jokes, British or the Germans? Actually, British or the Russians?
This is a diplomatic corps. They were not good with dirty jokes. Although I think probably the best ones would probably have been Russian.
I can see that. Somehow I can say. So were you a big Reagan fan with him telling his sense of humor, constantly telling jokes from stage?
Well, I didn't really know Reagan. I worked. He was one of the 4 presidents I worked for, and I enjoyed my 1 or 2 meetings with him. But I didn't know his personality or his personal style. I was the head of a negotiating team. I was not a close confidant of the president's.
Last question for you before we wrap up. If you were the enemy today, okay, say Russia comes to you with a blank check. They say, James, we're going to give you $1 billion. China's going to give you $1 billion. Iran's going to give you $1 billion. Tell us what is the best way to attack America today. What would you say it is?
Excuse me, I'll talk to you tomorrow, and then I go right to the office and say I'm going in to see a Russian who's pitched me tomorrow. How do you want me to handle it? I'll either play a game with them or I'll just say go to hell. But if you want me to lead them astray, let me know.
I respect that. I respect that. You know, but do you, and you don't even have to answer this. I'm just curious, asking you this question. Would you know the best way to internally destroy America? And if yes, is it in the progress of that becoming a reality and we have to fight like hell to keep it? Or no, the strategy you have, no one's talking about it?
I think that the thing that would probably influence not me, but a potential person like Ames decided to go with the Russians because of money. I think the thing that would most influence somebody like that would be his effort, probably to please his wife and family and children, and but just stack up money. I mean, if he can, without people knowing about it, if he could stack up tens of millions of dollars, enough to lead a very wealthy life, that would be the kind of person I think that would be most likely to turn to the Russians. The ideological folks who want to have a Lee Harvey Oswald type life and climb onto the ladder of the arriving aircraft coming back to Moscow and getting cheers and everybody loving them. That set of motivations, I think it'd be pretty hard for folks to come to now, if only because it's hard to find people who are going to make decisions based on something like that because they're afraid they get caught. But I don't think there are that many Americans that would go the route of leaning on the Russians for the future. There might be a few that would lean on a Russian ideology, as well has happened over history with a range of people that took mainly payment in affection and desire, like Oswald. So I don't know. I think it might be more likely to find a Chinese who was willing to do that, because I think the numbers are so huge that the possibility they would come across someone who was willing to take either funds or ideology, in a sense, as their payment. It could be a pretty substantial number of people.
I don't know if the Chinese would, because the Chinese, even if they pay you and you turned against them, the government would take out your family's life. They would, the fear of taking out your life. Americans, if you turn against the country, the government's not coming out of your family, because the government would still keep your family intact. China, if you cross the country is above the individual. And
Oh, sure.
America at least gives you a little bit protection of the individual, that even if you cross the line. So that's why I think it'd be easier to turn against America than it would be to turn against China. Again, I'm just a business guy. I'm just speculating, but I'm not the one that's the director of CIA here. I'm the one that's interviewing the director of CIA. So
I
uh,
think this country is, in spite of our recent chaos, is I think on balance uh, pretty likely to go to the FBI, uh, compared to most
I agree.
institutions and groups.
I totally. I asked the question from you only because when I sit there and I strategize with my board or my executives, and I ask, the question comes up about, if we were our own enemy and number one competitor, how would we try to hurt us? You have to think about that. You have to ask that question, because you learn that way. I ask that question because I would hope, and I would assume this is happening. The folks in charge of the CIA, the whatever organizations that are out there that are trying to protect the country, they ask the question: if the enemy wanted to take out America, how would you go about doing it? What would that strategy be? Because that would be what I would be spending my time having, almost like a blanket insurance policy around it, to make sure that never happened. And how I go about doing that would be, the right execution.
I'll tell you one, because I got clearance from the CIA because I was writing an op-ed some months ago. I got clearance from them to write this up and have it published. So I've got to say, I think it would be pretty effective, which is to put into a early old division electromagnetic pulse warhead, a EMP warhead that could be detonated at a low level, that could be detonated with a device that was a simple one, like pretty much like the nuclear device that
Yep.
was exploded, that we used at Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
First time that was brought up was by Newt Gingrich, by the way, in the 2011 or 2012 debate, when he brought up the EMP, and everybody was like, what the hell is an EMP? It had been around for a while, but no one, when they asked what's the biggest threat, everybody gave the general answer. And then Newt Gingrich shocked the whole world, and everybody started Googling EMP.
Yeah, no, that's right. That's right. He and I've been on panels together and stuff writing about this. But the bottom line is just detonate a low yield nuclear device, and you want to do it up at least, let's say, a mile or two. You could probably still have an effect if you detonated it up several miles, and it would take out pretty much all of the electromagnetic devices, including the um, the um, what am I thinking of? The
Phone towers, the servers, the internet, the electricity.
Yeah, all of those, but also the electric grid. If you may have mentioned it, that takes everything uh, within limits, and so being able to detonate an EMP is potentially devastating.
Well, hopefully everyone's going to play nice. Hopefully everyone's going to play nice, and hopefully everyone's, rather than thinking about attacking each other, they're playing a nice game of solitary or backgammon or spades or dominoes or whatever their choice and preferences of playing a game. But knowing when you're competing in the game of power, unfortunately, they're spending more time thinking about tactics and strategies
Yep.
of protecting themselves against the war than worried about who's going to get the highest score on backgammon or solitary. So maybe what we have to do is, instead of sending that EMP, we send the biggest distraction of video games, movies, shows, to distract the hell out of these leaders so they're consuming more entertainment than, going out there thinking about attacking each other. Who knows?
Goodness.
Maybe I watch too much cartoons with my kids, and my mind is going into cartoon strategies than actually real life strategies.
You realize that we're being saved from the evil cartoons by just as of yesterday. They're taking the Bugs Bunny
I
off,
saw that.
taking half a dozen of the key characters, because we're doing the evil thing by watching them with our kids sometimes.
The whole Dr. Susan and Pierce Morgan yesterday got canceled.
Yeah, I saw that.
As a conservative Democrat, what do you think about the cancel culture?
Absolutely idiotic.
Really? So you don't agree with the fact that we cancel what people say that could potentially hurt someone else's feelings?
That's right. My response to that when I hear it is almost always, get a life.
I appreciate that. Yeah. It's definitely one of the scariest thing that's happening, because it's the ultimate muzzle. I left Iran living in a country with a big muzzle where you can't even think negative thoughts about the country. And then you come to America, that handcuff, shackles, and muzzles back on, just in a different way. And you can only listen to one way of thinking, not the other way. So
Yep.
Who knows what's going to happen? Look, I got to tell you, I enjoyed it. I got smarter. I learned more of whether, if I ever get the call to want to be the director of CIA, to turn it down indefinitely and, stick to what I'm doing for a living. And for everybody that's watching this, James, we're going to put the link to your book below that folks can go order. Specifically, those of you that are very, very curious about the JFK assassination, highly recommend you go get the book and read it for yourself. And if you agree or disagree, tell us about it. But with that being said, once again, sir, thank you so much for making the time, for being a guest on Valuetainment.
Many thanks. Appreciate it very much. Great interview.
Appreciate you. Thank you. So many different versions of the JFK assassination story. What was your biggest takeaway? And as well as what it meant to be a director of CIA, any of the strategies when he and I talked about as a conservative Democrat, how he viewed different topics. I just want to hear your thoughts. And if you enjoyed this interview, I think you'll enjoy a short clip of an interview I did with Jim Jenkins, who was in the autopsy room, one of only 4 people who held John F. Kennedy's brain. And this is what he saw in the autopsy room. Watch this short clip. Something tells me after you watch the short clip, you're going to want to watch the entire interview. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.